Forgiving approach, often called the harmless error rule or substantial compliance.
Harmless bear.
Right. Under this rule, a court might probate a will that has a technical flaw if there's clear and convincing evidence that the decedent truly intended that document to be their will, and they mostly followed the rules. It's a safety net for wills that clearly show intent but messed up a formality. A big modern change trying to honor what people wanted. Other types of wills.
That flexibility seems like a good thing. Now, besides the standard will signed with witnesses, are there other types we need to know for essays?
Definitely. You'll see these pop up. A big one is the holographic will. That's a will written entirely in the testator's own handwriting and signed by them. Witnesses might not be needed, depending on the state.
Entirely handwritten.
Some states demand everything be handwritten. Others, and the UPC, are looser. Only the material provisions need to be handwritten. So you could maybe fill in blanks on a printed form as long as the important parts, who gets what, the signature, are in your hand. Proxy signatures. Never allowed for holographic wills. Must be the testator's own hand. Dating might also be required in some places. And intent is still key. Does it look like a will?
So it's about the testator's personal touch, but rules vary. What about self-proved wills?
A self-proved will makes probate easier. It's a will that's acknowledged by the testator and affirmed by the witnesses in front of a notary or court official, usually with a special affidavit attached. The big plus. The witnesses don't need to come to court later to testify that the signing was valid. It streamlines the process.
And nuncupative wills, oral wills. My gut says those are mostly out.
Your gut is right. Under the UPC and in most states, oral wills are generally not allowed anymore. They're mostly a historical thing. Some states have very narrow exceptions, maybe for soldiers in combat or sailors at sea, usually only for small amounts of personal property and only if made right before expected death. Extremely rare.
Okay, sticking to written wills is the way to go. What's a codicil? Is it like a PS to a will?
That's a great way to think of it. A codicil is a separate document that supplements an existing will. It alters, amends, or modifies parts of the will, but it doesn't replace the whole thing.
And it needs the same formalities. Absolutely.
Yeah.
A codicil has to be executed with the same formalities as a will, writing, signature witnesses. A valid codicil also republishes the will as of the date the codicil was signed. This can be important. It might make the will effective under newer laws or even validate a previously flawed will if the codicil properly refers to it.
Bypassing probate.
So codicils need the same serious treatment. Lastly, in this section, let's hit will substitutes. These skip probate entirely. Why are they so important for bar essays?
Critically important. Carve this out immediately in your analysis. Will substitutes are ways property gets transferred at death outside the formal probate court process. Think trusts, joint accounts, life insurance.
Why is that such a big deal?
Huge advantages. Usually faster, cheaper, and keeps things private, unlike public probate records. For your essay, non-probate property is always step one. You figure out what passes this way first, because that property never even enters the probate estate to be governed by the will or intestacy rules. If you miss identifying non-probate assets up front, your whole distribution analysis will be wrong.
Okay, non-probate first every single time. What are the common examples of these will substitutes we'll see?
Several key ones. A pour-over devise, where the will directs assets into a trust created during life. Valid, even if the trust was empty or revocable. A Totten trust, basically a bank account set up as trustee for someone, like a payable on death account. Deeds can work if they transfer an interest upon death, like a remainder. Jointly held property is huge joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Tenancy by the entirety of the surviving owner gets it automatically.
Okay, joint accounts are a big one.
Definitely. Also, payment on death, POD, or transfer on death, TOD, designations on bank accounts, brokerage accounts, retirement funds, and life insurance proceeds usually go straight to the named beneficiary, not through the estate unless the estate itself is the beneficiary. All these bypass the will.
Now, once a will's made, people change their minds. Life happens. That brings us to our next section. Revocation, changing, or eliminating a will. Can someone just tear up their will anytime, even if they promised someone they wouldn't?
Yes, absolutely. Fundamental point. A testator with capacity can revoke their will anytime before they die, period, even if they signed a contract saying they wouldn't revoke it.
So the contract doesn't stop them.
It doesn't stop the revocation itself. The will is revoked if they follow the right steps. But the person they promised might have a breach of contract lawsuit against the estate for damages later. The right to revoke the will itself is paramount.
Okay, the will's gone, but the estate might owe money. What are the main ways someone can actually revoke a will?
3 primary methods you need to know, and they often interplay. First, by making a subsequent instrument like a new will or codicil. Second, by physically destroying the will document. And third, sometimes automatically by operation of law due to major life events. Methods of revocation.
Let's start with revoking by a later document. How does that work? Does the new one have to say, I revoke my old will?
Good question. First off, just saying I revoke my will orally doesn't count. It has to be in writing. A testator can expressly revoke by stating clearly in a later will, codicil, or other formal writing, I revoke all prior wills.
Okay, explicit statement.
Or revocation can be implied if the terms of the new document are totally inconsistent with the old one. The later valid document basically overrides the earlier inconsistencies. And here's a key bar tip. Distinguishing a codicil from a new will. If the later document has a residuary clause, saying where everything left over goes, it's very likely meant to be a new will, replacing the old one entirely.
Ah, the residuary clause is a clue.
Big clue. If the later document doesn't have one, but the first will did, the later one is probably just a codicil, only amending the original. That detail helps you analyze the effect.
That's super useful. Okay, what about physical destruction? Burning, tearing. What counts? And how clear does the intent need to be?
Physical destruction involves acts like burning, tearing, canceling, like drawing lines through it, obliterating, or otherwise physically destroying a material portion of the will. The absolute key is, this physical act must happen at the same time as the intent to revoke. Act and intent must coincide.
Simultaneous act and intent.
Right. Someone else can destroy it for the testator, but only if it's explicitly at the testator's direction and in their conscious presence, meaning the testator is aware it's happening right then.
What counts as destruction? Does just writing canceled on the back work?
Depends. Under the majority rule, you generally need to deface the actual language, cross out words, tear through the signature. The UPC is a bit more lenient. The act just has to affect some part of the will, even if it doesn't hit the text directly. Like writing void across the front might be enough under the UPC.
So physical interaction is key. What if a will was definitely made, but just can't be found after death? Is it assumed revoked?
Yes, there's a strong presumption, but it's rebuttable. If a will was known to exist and was last seen in the testator's possession, but it's missing after death, the law presumes the testator destroyed it, intending to revoke it.
But you can overcome that presumption.
Yes, for example, if a duplicate original is found, or if there's evidence it was accidentally lost or destroyed by someone else. Conversely, if you destroy one executed original will, the law presumes you intended to revoke all duplicate originals too.
Interesting. Destroy one, destroy them all, unless proven otherwise. What about revocation by operation of law? Life events triggering it.
The big one here, heavily tested, is divorce. Under the majority rule, divorce automatically revokes any provisions in a will that benefit the now former spouse. It's like they legally predeceased the testator for those gifts, unless the will clearly says otherwise.
The divorce wipes them out of the will.
Pretty much. The UPC goes even further. It also revokes gifts to the former spouse's relatives. A minority rule might need a property settlement agreement along with the divorce. Interestingly, marriage usually doesn't revoke a prior will automatically. Instead, you might have an omitted spouse situation where the new spouse gets an intestate share.
And can you partially revoke? Just cross out one paragraph or gift. And what happens if you cross out words?
Yes. Partial revocation by physical act is generally allowed. You can cross out a specific gift, but there's a wrinkle. If the revoked gift was outside the residuary, the revocation might not be effective until the will is formally re-executed or republished. As for canceling words, you can generally cancel words to decrease a gift, like changing $10,000 to $5,000. But you usually cannot use cancellation alone to increase a gift, like changing $10,000 to $20,000 by writing over it. That requires new formalities, as it's like making a new gift. Yeah. So you can cut back but not add without redoing things properly. What if the will is just plain lost? We mentioned the presumption of revocation if it's missing, but can you ever probate a lost will?
It's possible, but tough. The person trying to probate the lost will has the heavy burden of proving its existence and its contents by clear and convincing evidence, much higher than the usual standard.
And a photocopy isn't good enough?
Generally, no. A photocopy isn't an original. But a duplicate original, another copy signed and witnessed with all the same formalities as the first one, can be admitted to probate. That's a key difference. Photocopy versus duplicate original.
Important distinction. What about revoking codicils versus wills? Is there a hierarchy?
Yes. If you revoke a codicil, the original will it amended usually comes back into full effect because the codicil is just a supplement. But if you revoke the main will, that automatically revokes all of its codicils too. The codicils depend on the will. Kill the will, you kill the codicils. Revival of prior wills.
Okay, that makes sense. This brings us to revival. This gets complicated. If Will 2 revokes Will 1 and then you revoke Will 2, does Will 1 automatically spring back to life? Sounds like a potential mess.
It is complicated, and states differ, which means prime essay material. The old common law view, now minority, said yes, automatic revival. Revoking the revoker brings back the original, like the second will never existed.
Simple, but maybe not intended.
Right. The majority rule today, no revival approach, says Will 2 acts immediately upon execution to revoke Will 1. Even if Will 2 is later revoked itself, Will 1 stays revoked. It does not automatically revive. You'd have to properly re-execute Will 1 or make a new will referring to it.
So, under the majority rule, you have to actively bring Will 1 back. How does the UPC handle this? It usually focuses on intent, right?
Exactly. The UPC is nuanced and intent-focused. It depends on how Will 2 was revoked. Was it by a physical act, like tearing it up, or by a later third will, Will 3?
Okay, act versus new will.
If revoked by act, the court looks at whether Will 2 revoked Will 1 wholly or partially. If wholly, the presumption is against revival of Will 1. The proponent of Will 1 has to prove the testator wanted it revived. If partially, the presumption is for revival of the revoked parts. The challenger has to prove the testator didn't want them revived. Extrinsic evidence is allowed here.
Lots of presumptions and burdens.
Yeah. Now, if Will 2 was revoked by a new Will 3, then Will 1 is revived only if the terms of Will 3 explicitly say that's the intent. No outside evidence allowed here. Will 3 has to state it clearly. Very fact-specific under the UPC.
That is detailed. Intent really drives the UPC approach. Okay, finally under revocation. Dependent relative revocation, or DRR. An equitable doctrine designed to fix mistakes.
Yes, DRR is equitable about fairness and a classic bar concept. If you see facts fitting this, you must discuss it. The rule is, a testator's revocation is ignored if it was based on a mistake of law or fact, like mistakenly believing a new will is valid when it's not, and the revocation wouldn't have happened but for that mistake.
So it cancels the revocation.
It effectively cancels the revocation, yes. The idea is the testator only revoked the old will because they thought the new plan would work. Since the new plan failed, the court might disregard the revocation to uphold the testator's likely preference for the old will over nothing at all, intestacy. The last effective will controls.
So if you spot a revocation that seems based on a factual error, think DRR. Excellent essay tip. Moving on. We usually think of wills as purely personal, but sometimes they're tied to agreements. Section 4. Will contracts. Promises about wills. These are basically contracts governed by contract law.
That's right. These are agreements about wills, contracts to make a will, contracts not to revoke a will, even contracts to die intestate. Since they're contracts, all the usual contract rules apply. Offer, acceptance, consideration, meeting of the minds. Got to be in writing, usually. Statute of frauds.
And how do you prove such a contract even existed? Seems like it could be hard to show someone promised something about their will after they're gone.
It can be tricky. The UPC outlines 3 main ways to establish a will contract. First, the will itself might actually state the contract's key terms.
Written right in the will.
Yep. Second, the terms might be in a separate written contract signed by the parties. Or third, the will might reference a contract. And then you can use extrinsic evidence outside proof to show the specific terms of that reference contract.
And enforceability needs consideration, signed. But can you sue while the person is still alive if they break the promise?
Needs consideration, yes, and signed by the party you're trying to enforce it against. Crucially for essays, there's no remedy for breach while the testator is still alive. They can change their will any time before death. The breach only happens and can only be sued upon after they die. So you can't stop them from changing their will midstream.
Can't sue while they're alive. Makes sense. You can always change your mind till death. What about wills with reciprocal promises, like joint wills or reciprocal wills? What's the deal with those?
You see these often, especially between spouses, and they have specific implications often tested. A joint will is one single document signed by 2 or more people, usually spouses. It contains reciprocal provisions that give things to each other and often suggests the gifts were made because of the mutual promises. Quick tip. If you see a joint will in an essay fact pattern, immediately think about a possible contract not to revoke. It's heavily implied sometimes.
So the joint nature itself hints at a contract. What about reciprocal wills? Sounds similar.
Reciprocal wills, or mutual wills, are separate wills made by 2 or more people, but they have identical or mirror image provisions, like Husband leaves everything to wife, then kids. Wife leaves everything to husband, then kids, in her separate will. The key difference. With reciprocal wills, there's no presumption of a contract not to revoke just from the wills themselves. Either person can usually change their separate will freely, unless you can prove a separate contract existed.
So the presumption is the big difference. Joint might imply a contract. Reciprocal usually doesn't on its own. What's the general rule on these presumptions, and what happens if a contract is proven and then broken?
Most states and the UPC say that just making joint or reciprocal wills does not automatically create a presumption of a contract not to revoke. The burden is on the person claiming a contract exists to prove it one of those three ways we mentioned.
Okay, no automatic presumption.
Right. But if a contract is proven, and say the first spouse dies honoring it, but the surviving spouse later changes their will, breaking the contract, the remedy is usually a constructive trust. The court imposes this trust on the property the second spouse wrongly transferred, forcing it to go to the originally intended beneficiaries according to the contract. It's an equitable way to enforce the deal after the fact.
Okay, we've covered making wills, revoking them, even contracts about them. Now let's talk about actually reading and applying the will after death construction. Interpreting and managing gifts in a will. Why is it so important to classify the different types of gifts in a will?
Classifying gifts is absolutely crucial because it dictates the order of distribution and, more importantly, the order of abatement. That's the order in which gifts get reduced or eliminated if the estate doesn't have enough money or property to cover everything promised in the will.
Abatement, the reduction order. Got it.
If the testator didn't specify an order, the law has a default one. Correctly classifying each gift is step one in figuring out who gets cut first if funds are short.
So what are the main gift classifications we need to nail down?
Four main types. A specific gift, legacy, devise, bequest, is a gift of a particular identifiable piece of property. My Rolex watch, my house on Elm Street, those 100 shares of Apple stock I own, you can point right to it.
Specific item. Okay.
A general legacy is usually a gift of money, paid from the general assets of the estate. $10,000 to my nephew. The executor can use any available funds.
General cash.
A demonstrative legacy is a hybrid. It's a cash gift intended to be paid from a particular source. But if that source isn't enough, it can be paid from general assets. $10,000 to my niece to be paid from my Bank of America savings account.
Specific source, but fallback to general.
Exactly. And finally, a residuary gift is the catch-all. It's whatever property is left over after all the specific, general, and demonstrative gifts have been paid out. I give the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate to my spouse.
The leftovers. Got it. Abatement, order of reduction. And that classification directly leads to abatement reducing gifts when assets run short. What's that default statutory order if the testator didn't specify? Who gets cut first?
This hierarchy is vital for essays involving broke estates. If the will is silent, the law says gifts abate in this order, from first cut to last protected. First, property passing by intestacy, if any wasn't covered by the will. That goes first.
Intestate property first.
Then the residuary gifts get hit. Next, general gifts, like the $10,000 cash gifts, are reduced, usually pro rata amongst themselves. And finally, specific gifts, like the Rolex or the house, are the last to be reduced or eliminated.
So specific items are most protected.
Right. And that demonstrative gift, it's treated as specific up to the value of its named source. If the source is dry, the remaining amount is treated as general and abates with the other general gifts. Within each class, abatement is proportional. Everyone in that category takes the same percentage hit.
So if things are tight, intestate property, then residuary, then general cash, and finally specific items. Clear hierarchy. What about redemption? When a specific gift mentioned in the will is just gone by the time the testator dies.
Redemption is basically the gift failing, because the specific item isn't in the estate anymore. This mostly impacts specific gifts. You can't redeem a general gift of $10,000 because the executor could just use other cash. But if the will says my 1965 Mustang and the testator sold it years ago, that's redemption.
And there are two main ways courts handle this redemption by extinction, right? An old way and a newer way.
Yes, a major split here. The traditional approach, the identity theory, is very strict, very literal. If that specific item, the Mustang, is not physically part of the estate at death, the gift is deemed. Beneficiary gets nothing. Doesn't matter why it's gone or what the testator might have intended.
Tough luck, basically.
Pretty much. The UPC approach, the intent theory, is much more flexible and tries to be fair. It looks at the testator's likely intent when they got rid of the property. There's a slight presumption against redemption.
So the beneficiary might still get something.
Possibly. Under the UPC, the beneficiary might get things like the remaining balance of the purchase price if it was sold but not fully paid for, or insurance proceeds if it was destroyed, or property acquired as a replacement. The UPC tries to give the beneficiary the economic equivalent if possible, based on intent.
That seems much more reasonable. What about liens on property? Exoneration of liens. If I inherit a house with a mortgage, does the estate pay off the mortgage for me?
Again, depends on the jurisdiction. The old common law rule said yes. The estate usually pays off the mortgage or lien on specifically devised property. Unless the will says not to, the beneficiary gets it free and clear.
Nice for the beneficiary.
Yeah, but the majority rule now is the opposite. The beneficiary takes the property subject to the mortgage. The estate does not automatically pay it off unless the will specifically directs it to pay debts. So, under the majority rule, you inherit the house and the mortgage payment. Big difference financially.
Huge difference. So check the jurisdiction and the will's wording. What about redemption by satisfaction? Sounds like getting your inheritance early.
Kind of. Redemption by satisfaction applies when the testator gives a beneficiary a gift during their lifetime that is intended to prepay or satisfy a gift made to that same person in the will.
Like an advance on the inheritance.
Exactly. Under the traditional view, a substantial lifetime gift after the will was made was often presumed to be in satisfaction of the will's gift, if intent was shown. But the UPC flips that presumption. Under the UPC, a lifetime gift is not treated as satisfaction unless the testator declares it so in a writing made around the same time, or the beneficiary acknowledges it in writing as satisfaction. Requires clear written proof to avoid arguments over everyday gifts.
When a beneficiary dies first.
Okay, we've covered gifts that might be gone. What about beneficiaries who die before the testator? That's lapse, right? What's the basic rule?
The basic rule of lapse is simple. If a named beneficiary in a will dies before the testator dies, the gift to that beneficiary lapses, it fails.
And where does the failed gift go?
Typically, it falls into the residuary clause of the will. If there's no residuary clause, or if the lapse gift was the residuary gift itself, then it passes via intestacy to the testator's heirs. But the testator can always specify an alternate taker in the will.
But there are anti-lapse statutes that change this default rule. These seem really important.
Hugely important exceptions, and almost every state has one. Anti-lapse statutes are designed to save gifts from failing when the beneficiary predeceases the testator, usually to keep the gift in the family line.
How do they work?
Generally, if the deceased beneficiary was a relative of the testator, the statute defines which relatives count, usually descendants, sometimes siblings, etc., and that deceased relative left issue, their own descendants who survive the testator, then the gift doesn't lapse. Instead, it passes down to that deceased beneficiary's issue.
So it goes to the beneficiary's kids, for instance.
Exactly, it substitutes them in. Importantly, anti-lapse statutes usually apply before you determine if a class gift fails. If a gift is to my siblings and one sibling predeceases leaving kids, those kids usually take their parents' share via the anti-lapse statute.
Keeps it in the family line. What if it's a residuary beneficiary who dies, someone getting the leftovers?
Another split in the rules here. Under the UPC, if one of several residuary beneficiaries dies, and anti-lapse doesn't apply, maybe they weren't a relative, their share is just divided up among the other surviving residuary beneficiaries. It stays within the residue.
Okay, UPC keeps it with the other residuary takers.
But under the common law, no residue of a residue rule, which some states still follow, if a portion of the residuary gift lapses, that lapsed portion doesn't go to the other residuary beneficiaries. Instead, it drops out of the will entirely and passes via intestacy to the testator's heirs. Can lead to very different results.
Big difference again. UPC versus common law. Okay, quickly. What's the difference between a void gift and a lapsed gift? Sounds like timing.
Exactly, timing. A gift is void if the beneficiary was already dead when the will was signed. The gift was impossible from the start. A gift is lapsed if the beneficiary was alive when the will was signed, but died after that, but before the testator died. The good news, anti-lapse statutes usually apply to both void and lapsed gifts if the conditions, relative left issue, are met. Incorporation by reference.
So anti-lapse can save both void and lapsed gifts. Now, can you bring outside documents into a will? Incorporation by reference, what does that let you do?
Incorporation by reference allows a writing that wasn't executed with will formalities, not signed witnessed like a will, to basically become part of the will and dictate how property is distributed.
How does that work? What are the rules?
3 strict requirements. 1, the outside writing must have existed when the will was signed. 2, the will must show the testator's intent to incorporate that specific writing. And 3, the will must describe the writing clearly enough so you can identify exactly which document is meant. If you meet all three, that separate list or memo controls the gifts it describes. Acts of independent significance.
So you can point to an existing list. What about acts of independent significance? How is that different?
This is another way a will can refer to outside things, but it's about events or facts rather than specific documents. It allows a will to designate a beneficiary or determine the amount of a gift by reference to some act or event that has significance apart from its effect on the will. And this act or event can happen before